Hello friends. Welcome to Book Insider. Today we are going to talk about The Art of Thinking Clearly by Rolf Dobelli. Rahul was an ordinary guy, but everything in his life seemed to be upside down. He always thought that no matter what he did, success never seemed to come his way. Whether it was studying, making friends, or any other task, failure always knocked on his door. This constant struggle was starting to break him down from the inside. Every day, he would ask himself the same question. Why does fate never seem to favor me? Rahul's mind was always filled with sadness and frustration. As he walked home from school, he often found himself lost in these thoughts, wondering what would become of him. One day, as he stepped outside, he encountered a man. The man lived in the same neighborhood as Rahul, but Rahul had never really taken notice of him before. His name was Rohan. He appeared completely ordinary, yet there was something unique in his eyes, an unmistakable spark, as if he had seen and understood every color of life. That day, Rohan noticed Rahul sitting alone in the park, looking troubled. Without directly asking, Rohan approached him, gently initiating a conversation. "You seem upset," he said softly. "Is everything okay?" Rahul hesitated at first, but then he poured his heart out to Rohan. He explained how, no matter what decision he made, it always turned out to be the wrong one. He felt like his luck was simply bad. Rohan listened attentively and then smiled, offering to tell him a story. "There was once a farmer," Rohan began. "He planted seeds in his field, hoping for a good harvest. But when the time came, there was no rain, and his crops failed. People said he had planted at the wrong time, which was why his harvest didn't succeed. But the truth was, the farmer had planted the seeds at the right time. It was just that the weather didn't cooperate. This is called the outcome bias," Rohan continued. "We often judge something based on its result, when we should understand that even with the right decision, the outcome can still be bad. And sometimes, even a wrong decision can lead to good results." Rahul listened carefully, though he didn't quite understand everything. He asked, "Are you saying that even if I make the right decision, the outcome can still be bad?" Rohan laughed and nodded. "Exactly. And sometimes you might make the wrong choice, but by sheer luck, the outcome could be good. So, don't judge your decisions only by the results. Focus on whether you made the decision with the right intention and whether it was the right choice at the time." Rahul thought about this. "So, does that mean that every time I fail, it isn't necessarily because of the wrong decisions I made?" "Yes, absolutely," Rohan replied. "Sometimes, the outcome is beyond our control. What matters is whether you made the decision thoughtfully. This way, the fear of failure will begin to fade." For the first time, Rahul felt a shift in his thoughts. He realized that his failures didn't necessarily mean he had made poor choices. Maybe his decisions and efforts had been right, but the circumstances just weren't in his favor. Rohan continued, "There's one more thing you need to understand. In life, outcomes don't always appear immediately. Some decisions take time to show their effects. So, patience is key." Rahul nodded, and for the first time, a small smile crept onto his face. He began to understand that maybe, just maybe, his struggles didn't mean he was doomed to failure. The lesson was sinking in. Patience, perspective, and trust in the process were vital. As Rahul sat there, thinking about everything Rohan had said, he realized that his mindset was beginning to change. He no longer had to fear failure the way he once did. There was a deeper understanding taking root within him, one that could help him make clearer, more informed decisions moving forward. It felt like a heavy burden had been lifted from his heart. Rahul now understood that he needed to focus on the quality of his decisions, rather than just the outcomes. From that day on, he promised himself that he would make every decision with greater care. But even if the result wasn't favorable, he wouldn't blame himself. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. This was just the beginning. Rahul's journey was far from over, and his meeting with Rohan would teach him even more important lessons. But for now, he had taken the first step. Changing the way he thought was his biggest victory. Rahul was beginning to feel better. The lessons he learned from Rohan had sparked a change in his thinking. He now understood that basing decisions solely on outcomes wasn't always the right approach. But Rahul still had many questions about life. He often wondered why everything seemed to go wrong for him. Despite trying to follow the right path, there were times when even his best decisions led to failure. One day, Rahul went back to the same park where he had met Rohan. He had started visiting it more often, hoping for another chance to meet him. And sure enough, after a while, he spotted Rohan walking toward him. Rahul smiled as their eyes met. "How's it going, Rahul?" Rohan asked, as he approached. "I'm a little better," Rahul replied. "But sometimes, I still don't know if what I'm doing is right or not." Rohan studied him carefully and then smiled, sitting next to him. "It's great that you're starting to make decisions more thoughtfully, but there's one more thing you need to understand." Rahul looked at him curiously. "What's that?" he asked. "Have you ever heard of confirmation bias?" Rohan asked. Rahul shook his head, indicating that he hadn't. "Let me explain," Rohan began. "Confirmation bias is a very common mental issue. It happens when a person only pays attention to information that confirms their existing beliefs or opinions, while ignoring facts or evidence that contradict them. This deeply affects our thinking and decision-making, often preventing us from making the right choices." Rahul still didn't fully grasp it. "So, you're saying that we only focus on the things that align with what we already believe and ignore everything else?" he asked. Rohan nodded. "Exactly. Let me give you an example. Suppose you believe that you're a failure. In that case, your thinking will be clouded by the idea that everything bad that happens to you is because you're a failure. But what if some of these things are happening due to circumstances beyond your control, not because you're failing?" Rahul thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes, I often think that maybe I'm just wrong every time." Rohan smiled. "That's confirmation bias at work. You're only focusing on the things that reinforce your belief that you're a failure, while ignoring the things that could show you otherwise." Rahul was listening more closely now, realizing that many of his struggles were due to this pattern of thinking. He could see how his perception of himself had shaped his reality in a way that wasn't entirely true. He was beginning to understand how his mind had been clouded by beliefs that weren't necessarily factual. He had always focused on the things that confirmed his negative thinking, whether it was his poor grades at school or a falling out with friends. He always blamed himself, thinking that he was the one at fault. "So, did that mean I'm proving my own decisions wrong?" Rahul asked. "Many times, yes," Rohan replied. "When we form an opinion about something, our focus shifts to only those things that validate our belief. This bias pulls us further away from the truth and limits our thinking." Rahul was beginning to understand the magnitude of the flaw in his thinking. He had always assumed that he was a failure, which is why he never paid attention to things that could have helped him move forward. "So, how do I avoid this confirmation bias?" Rahul asked, curious. "First and foremost, you need to keep your mind open," Rohan explained. "Don't focus only on things that confirm your existing beliefs, but also pay attention to things that might challenge your thinking. This means you need to question your assumptions and approach things from different perspectives." Rahul paused for a moment, thinking. "So, you mean I should always consider the possibility that I might be wrong?" he asked. "Exactly," Rohan said. "Always keep in mind that you could be wrong. If you don't keep your mind open, you won't be able to make the right decisions. Think from multiple angles and evaluate the facts carefully. Rahul took a deep breath. This idea was new to him. He had always assumed that his thoughts and beliefs were correct, but now he understood that his thinking could deceive him. There's one more thing, Rohan added. Whenever you make a decision, look at it from a neutral perspective afterward. Don't just assume it's right or wrong. Instead, ask yourself whether you've considered all the facts and information. Rahul was starting to grasp this. He realized that the decisions in his life that had gone wrong weren't necessarily because of his failure, but because he had limited his thinking and ignored the aspects that contradicted his beliefs. A new way of thinking had begun to take root in Rahul's mind. He now knew that he couldn't rely solely on his assumptions. Every time, he needed to look at things from different viewpoints and challenge his own beliefs. In the end, Rohan concluded, when you keep your mind open and challenge your own thoughts, you'll see changes in your life. You'll start making better decisions, and your results will improve as well. Just remember, truth doesn't always appear from one single perspective. Look at it from all sides. Rahul nodded and thanked Rohan. He realized that once again, Rohan had taught him an important lesson. After that day, Rahul started to reflect on each of his decisions more carefully. He no longer focused only on the things that aligned with his thinking. Instead, he began to ask himself, am I missing something in my thinking? This new approach slowly started to change his life. With the awareness of confirmation bias, Rahul began to keep his mind open and look at everything from different perspectives. Now, he thought deeply about every decision and began challenging his old beliefs. But there was still much for him to learn. One day, Rahul was sitting in the park, reading a psychology book that he had picked up on Rohan's advice. Just then, he saw Rohan approaching, his face always carrying that calm smile. Rahul saw him and smiled back. "Hello, uncle. You're here again," he said. Rohan laughed and replied, "I had to meet you again, so here I am." He sat next to Rahul, glancing at the book in his hands. "What book are you reading?" "It's a psychology book," Rahul answered enthusiastically. "After the advice you gave me, I thought I should learn more about these things." Rohan nodded thoughtfully and asked, "So, how are you feeling now? Do you feel a change in your thinking?" "Yes, absolutely," Rahul replied. "Now, I make decisions more carefully and try to challenge my beliefs. But even then, sometimes I find myself confused. It's a long process." "Changing your thinking takes time," Rohan said. "But once you start understanding it, you'll see a lot of changes in your life. Today, I'm here to teach you another important lesson that will help make your thinking even better." Rahul's curiosity piqued. "What's that?" he asked eagerly. "Have you ever heard of the halo effect?" Rohan asked. Rahul thought for a moment and shook his head. "No, I haven't." Rohan began explaining. The halo effect is a cognitive bias where we judge a person or thing based on one of its qualities. In other words, if someone seems good at one thing, we assume they are good at everything else. For example, if someone is charismatic, we might think they're capable, even if they don't have the skills for that task. Rahul listened carefully and asked, "So, this means we form an entire image of someone based on just one trait?" "Exactly," Rohan replied. "And this bias can often lead us to make wrong decisions. We get influenced by one characteristic of a person or thing and ignore all the other qualities. This prevents us from making accurate judgments." Rahul recalled many moments from his life when this had happened. He remembered how, in school, he would sometimes form opinions about his teachers or friends based on just their outward behavior or one action. He would even assume that if someone looked good, they were also smart, which wasn't always the case. Does this mean we can't look at people from the perspective of their various qualities? Rahul asked. Exactly, Rohan answered. When we're under the influence of the halo effect, we judge a person's entire character based on one trait. But we must understand that a person's qualities are not the same across the board. Every person can have different traits, and we need to assess each one individually. Rahul thought for a moment. He realized how many times he had made this mistake in his life. He had often formed opinions about friends, colleagues, or even family members based on just one aspect of their behavior. And those opinions weren't always accurate. So, this means we need to look at every person and every trait separately. Rahul asked. Exactly, Rohan confirmed. Yes, Rohan replied. We must assess every person's qualities without being influenced by just one trait. For example, if someone is a good speaker, it doesn't mean they will be equally good at everything. Or if someone is successful, it doesn't automatically mean they are morally right. We should evaluate each quality separately and understand it. Rahul found this idea very important. He realized that he had often formed misunderstandings about people or things simply because he had been influenced by the halo effect. But how can we avoid this? Rahul wondered. If our thinking naturally works this way, how can we stop it? Rohan looked at him and said, the first step is to recognize when you're under the influence of the halo effect. Whenever you think about a person or thing, ask yourself, am I evaluating their other qualities based on just one trait? If the answer is yes, pause and evaluate each trait individually. Rahul nodded. I understand. So, we shouldn't form opinions about someone without knowing the whole picture. We can't assume that just because someone excels at one thing, they're right about everything. Exactly, Rohan agreed. When you understand this, you'll be able to make better decisions. You won't ignore other qualities just because you were influenced by one. This will clarify your thinking and help you make wiser choices. Rahul took a deep breath and smiled. He realized another significant shift was about to happen in his thinking. He had decided he wouldn't assess a person or thing based solely on one trait anymore. Rohan added, this lesson is crucial, Rahul. If you grasp this, it can lead to major changes in your life. Rahul nodded and thanked Rohan. He now understood that the solution to many of his problems lay in his thinking. After that day, Rahul started recognizing the halo effect in his life. Whenever he met someone, he would ask himself, am I judging them as completely right based on just one trait? Slowly, he began shedding this habit. But Rahul's journey wasn't over. He still had much to learn, and Rohan had many lessons left to teach. After learning about the halo effect, Rahul now faced new challenges. He knew that his journey with Rohan would get even deeper. Changes had already begun in his life. The lessons Rohan had taught him were becoming a part of his thinking. Understanding the outcome bias, confirmation bias, and the halo effect had improved Rahul's decision-making skills. But he still felt like something was missing, as if his journey wasn't complete. One day, Rahul was sitting in the park again, where he often met Rohan. He noticed something was different today. Instead of seeing Rohan, there was an empty bench where they usually sat together. A slight unease crept into Rahul's heart. He thought, what if Rohan hasn't come today? Just then, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Rohan. Rahul, you've come a long way. Now, the final lesson is here. This time, try to find it on your own. Rahul was puzzled. He didn't understand what Rohan meant, but he knew his journey was far from over. Rahul wondered what Rohan was trying to convey, but he decided to find the final lesson on his own. Over the next few days, he carefully examined every aspect of his life. He started asking himself questions like, what do I consider right? Is my thinking heading in the right direction? After a few days, Rahul began to understand what the final lesson was. He realized that it was all about perception bias, or the way he viewed things, which was the foundation of all his decisions. One day, Rohan suddenly appeared in the park again. As soon as Rahul saw him, he said, "Uncle, I've got it now. In the end, our perspective or perception is what matters the most. The way we see things influences our decisions. We need to keep our thinking and perspective balanced." Rohan smiled and said, "Exactly, Rahul. Every person sees things from their own perspective, and that's what shapes their thoughts and decisions. Now, you've learned what I've been trying to teach you." Rahul felt like his journey was complete. He had learned that the most important thing in life is to understand your own thinking and continuously improve it. He had started to carefully review every thought and decision he made. He knew now that the real strength lay in the ability to view and understand any situation in the right way. "But uncle," Rahul asked one last time, "does this journey of thinking ever end?" Rohan smiled and replied, "The journey of thinking never ends. Every day brings a new lesson. The only difference now is that you are ready to understand and embrace those lessons." Rahul nodded. He could now see his direction clearly. He understood that in life, achieving success isn't just about hard work, but also about having the right mindset.